Hello everyone, this is Fernanda from O Prazer da Literatura, and in this video I will talk to you about Gothic literature. There is already another video about the Gothic in this channel, and in fact it is one of the videos with the highest number of views, but unfortunately that's only available in Portuguese. But if you would like to watch it, I will link it up here. But in that video, I focused on an overview of the Gothic throughout the centuries. So how it entered the 19th and in the 20th centuries. And I gave you suggestions of books to read in this style. But in this video today, I would like to give you an introduction to the literary genre Gothic since its beginnings and how it began in the late 18th century. So when we talk about Gothic, we have to think about the word. It was first used, the word Gothic was first used in the Renaissance to refer back to a medieval type of architecture. In fact, the Renaissance artist and architect, the Italian Giorgio Vasari, used this verb barbarian and Gothic to refer back to this architecture from the late medieval period up to the 15th century. So that type of architecture with stained glass windows and pointed arches, ogival arches, and those enormous vaults. So if you're thinking about the Notre Dame de Paris, you are right. Notre Dame de Paris is one of the finest examples of the French Gothic. And that type of architecture was considered by the Renaissance artists and architects as terrible and outdated, because this type of architecture had destroyed the splendor of ancient Greece and Rome. And it's no wonder that in the Renaissance period, there was this idea of the medieval past as the Dark Ages, in contrast to the light of the Renaissance. And in the Renaissance, they looked back at ancient Greece and Rome as for the standard of beauty, hence the term classicism then. And indeed, Giorgio Vasari used Gothic in a very negative way to refer to this medieval architecture. So Gothic architecture is one thing, medieval up to the 15th century. But when we talk about Gothic literature, it's something completely different. We are now in the second half of the 18th century. In fact, the first book that is considered the first Gothic text in English literature dates back to 1864, and it is the classic The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole. And Walpole's text had a subtitle that read A Gothic Story. But in the 18th century, the word Gothic had a very broad sense. It referred to a general Middle Ages, a medieval past, and medieval ways of living and being. So when Walpole wrote the subtitle A Gothic Story, it was more related to the setting of his story in the Castle of Otranto, which indeed is set in the Middle Ages, a very broad and general Middle Ages. However, Walpole added elements that would be very specific to this new type of text that was appearing just then with this text. Some elements such as, so the idea of the setting in a medieval past, castles, monasteries, palaces in ruins, secret passages, dark alleyways, doors that close by themselves, moving portraits, underground passages, and of course the supernatural atmosphere. All this sprang from Walpole's text and became intrinsically connected to the Gothic genre as we know it today. So Walpole published The Castle of Otranto in 1764, but the Gothic reached its zenith at the end of the century, more specifically in the decade of the 1790s, with the writer Anne Radcliffe, who took the Gothic into her own arms and produced her own particular type of Gothic. In the 1790s, she published her most famous books. So, for instance, in 1790, she published A Sicilian Romance. In 1791, The Romance of the Forest. 1794, the famous The Mysteries of Udolpho. And you may have heard about The Mysteries of Udolpho if you're a Jane Austen fan, because Jane Austen's protagonist, Catherine Morland, in the Northanger Abbey, reads The Mysteries of Udolpho. And Northanger Abbey is in fact a parody of the Gothic style, which is quite interesting. So this was The Mysteries of Udolpho was published in 1794. All these books were extremely popular, and no wonder Anne Radcliffe became the highest paid professional writer of the 1790s. But her type of Gothic was different than Walpole. In fact, all the supernatural elements and atmosphere that are part of the Radcliffean Gothic is explained at the end by a rational explanation. So in fact, it was not supernatural at all. So here we see two different types of Gothic appearing, let's say. So on the one hand, the Gothic that has this supernatural atmosphere, but at the end is explained rationally. On the other hand, a different type of Gothic in which the supernatural actually exists. And there was, in fact, this challenge of the limits or the boundaries between natural and supernatural, or death and life. Indeed, the Gothic is all about oppositions and the blurring of limits. So, like I said, death and life, supernatural and natural, reality and imagination or dream, female and male. So it's all about challenging and blurring these limits, which is quite interesting. Apart from that, the Radcliffean Gothic is very particular. She has a very poetic language. And in an essay that she wrote called On the Supernatural in Poetry, which was published only after her death, she makes a very interesting distinction between terror and horror, which is very important to understanding the developments of the Gothic throughout the 18th, 19th, and up to our days. So on the one hand, we have the terror, which is the type of Gothic that Anne Radcliffe thought was superior to horror. The terror is all about that feeling of anxiety felt both by the protagonist or the characters as well as by the reader. So this supernatural threat hovers the whole narrative, but it's more in the shadows, it's more suggested, and it gives this feeling of being on edge, of anxiety. This is terror. On the other hand, horror is much more explicit. So horror is gory, violent, bloody. You see monsters. It's very sexualized, much more visual, much more graphic than the suggested terror. So terror, Radcliffean Gothic was indeed terror. Another example of the terror that I can think of is one of my favorite stories ever, Harry James, The Turn of the Screw. If you've read it, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't read it yet, please do. It's a fascinating story of this whole atmosphere of suspense, of trying to figure out what this supernatural threat is. That is terror. On the other hand, an example of horror, a contemporary of Anne Radcliffe was Matthew Lewis, who wrote The Monk. And The Monk it's also a classic Gothic story nowadays, but at the time it was very criticized because it was a scandal. It was so, it was very polemic because it dealt with this visual description of blood and sex and horror. So very, very graphic, type of Gothic. And indeed, that is, think about horror movies, that is horror. And Radcliffean terror was very much linked to the idea of the sublime. So the theory of the sublime was put forward by the philosopher Edmund Burke in his inquiry into the sublime and beautiful. And the sublime is the idea of this encounter of the human being with the grandness of nature, the insignificance of the human being facing this enormity of all-powerful nature, and the feeling that you get that is a mixture of both terror and admiration. So think about this. Imagine yourself in a boat in the middle of the ocean, in the middle of nowhere, during a thunderstorm with lightning and the fury of the waves. So this feeling that you get, this extreme feeling, that's sublime. Another example, imagine yourself standing at the top of a very high cliff, looking down at the rocks in the bottom, and on a very windy day. So this idea of being alive but feeling close to death, and it heightens the faculties. This is the sublime, and the idea of the sublime was even more explored by the Romantic poets at the end of the century, beginning of the 19th century. And for Radcliffe, terror was very much linked to the idea of the sublime. No wonder a lot of Romantic poets looked back at Radcliffe as Mother Radcliffe, who had started in that direction. So you see in Radcliffean Gothic this encounter with nature and this feeling of sublime, very poetic descriptions, while when you encounter a castle in ruins and you think about the majesty of the past and the force of nature that's still there for centuries and centuries. The ocean's still there, the forests are still there, but the human being just fades away. It's a very interesting idea. I love the concept of sublime, and that was the boom of the Gothic in the 1790s. So the very first appearance of Gothic literature. But of course, it did not stop there. At the turn of the century, in the 19th century, we see a different path, let's say. And the classic example of this is, of course, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, that was first published in 1818, but later revised and republished in 1831. And Mary Shelley, she combines this idea of the supernatural with the contemporary scientific and technological advancements. So Victor Frankenstein creates a supernatural creature, but that is based on scientific and technological knowledge that belonged to that period of the beginning of the 19th century. An amazing story. And at the end of the 19th century, there's another peak in popularity in Gothic literature. And again, this oppositions every time, but the opposition between the modernity with this superstitious past. A great example is, of course, Dracula from 1897 by the Irish Bram Stoker. So in Dracula, Count Dracula comes from Eastern Europe with all this superstition, archaic past and power, aristocratic power, and haunt and threats contemporary and modern London. Other examples are Robert Louis Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. So there was a very big revival of the Gothic at the end of the 19th century. And the Gothic has entered the 20th and the 21st centuries. So I can think of authors such as Anne Rice, Stephen King, who were still very much based on all this Gothic tradition that started at the end of the 18th century with Horace Walpole, and all the different media that are available nowadays. So the Gothic has gone, it was already in the theaters already back in the 18th century, but now the Gothic is in cinema, in TV series, video games. So it is indeed, it has spread, and I hope continues to grow, because many interesting, fascinating stories have sprung from this tradition. So here we are. I hope you have enjoyed to know more about the this introduction to Gothic literature, how it started, and the name that was given to it, and how it's developed throughout the centuries. If you have enjoyed this video, do not forget to like, to give a comment. If you're not yet subscribed to the channel, please do. And I wish you a very nice week and happy reading.